So in the second video, we're going to look at the solutions that people propose that are supposed to get us out of this mess. And we refer to the technologies as being clean and green, and that can discourage us from really thinking too much about where they come from. It's easy to act like they just sprout out of the ground, or a fairy waves a magic wand, or a stork brings them. So the first angle that we'll seek to understand these technologies is in terms of what we harness and how. And to make that easier to talk about, I will introduce two terms, stocks and flows. So basically, stocks are nouns, flows are verbs. Stocks are things like coal and petroleum that you could either hold in your hand or contain in a barrel, whereas the flows, verbs, are things like the sun shining, the wind blowing, water flowing. And with our technologies, it's not like we can use those exist in their original forms. You can't just leave your electric vehicle and your laptop outside and let them charge. It has to be converted to electricity. And to do that, we need equipment, industrial equipment. And so the way that you make that is through processes that require fossil fuels. So first you have to mine the raw materials, then you have to transport it because these are found all over the world. Like no country has all of the resources that it needs to make these. So then you have to transport it, and then you have to manufacture stuff, and then you have to transport that to the final location and then install it. And again, all of that requires fossil fuels. So next up is storage and transportation or transmission. So this is about having the energy to be able to use it at various times and in various places. And so in the case of something like a stock, that's a little bit easier because once you've extracted it, it just exists because it's made out of material. And so it's there when you want to use it, whenever that is. And then if the where of where you want to use it is different, well, then you just transport it in a train, a truck, a pipeline. Flows are different because, again, they are like verbs and they don't happen all the time because nature is inconsistent. The sun doesn't always shine. Nighttime happens. Sometimes the sun doesn't shine at all, and the wind doesn't always blow. So part of how we overcome this is by building in redundancy, which means having extra of the harvesting equipment, like the panels and the turbines, in places where we know more reliably that it happens often, and that way you can overproduce, overharvest there, and then have extra to share with users in other places, and then also to save to use at other times. But then for that, you need even more infrastructure. So you need batteries, regardless of what they are made of. They're made of some kind of material, and generally it's not something that is being recycled to make that first generation. Like to make the first one, you need to get that material fresh. And then also for the power cables, those contain metals, and then they're coated in a plastic, which is derived from petroleum. So you've got to acquire all that in the first place. And that is an industrial process. It involves mining and manufacturing and transportation and set up with utility vehicles. Like when you have a power cable go down in a storm, the truck that shows up to fix it is powered by fossil fuels. And so this whole process is reliant on fossil fuels. The form of the energy and the options here are electricity or combustion. And combustion is what happens when you burn fuel. So if you drive a gas car, that's what's happening in your engine. And when we look both at the global industrial system as well as nation by nation, for the most part, it is 20% running on electricity and 80% running on combustion. And fossil fuels can be used to do it all. You can burn them to produce the electricity for the 20%, or you can burn them in a combustion engine, furnace, whatever, to power the other 80%. But when we harness flows, we're converting them into electricity, and that electricity only meets the requirements of the 20% of our global industrial system of all these things that we're trying to use it to power. And so if you want that electricity to be able to power everything that we care about, well, now you have to replace all of it. So in the same way, we're all aware that if you want your car to be able to get powered by solar panels, you need to trade in your gas car for an electric car. And basically, we've done that. 20% of our world is taken care of, but that other 80% still has to be swapped out in that way. And maybe some of it can be retrofitted. Like maybe, obviously not in the case of cars so far, but even if we find some way to not have to do everything over from scratch, whatever part we do have to do over, that's all being fueled by fossil fuels. You're producing new parts or new entire mechanisms, machinery, and to do that, you need to extract the fossil fuels, refine the fossil fuels, extract raw materials, transport the raw materials, manufacture them into something, and then again transport or install them wherever. And that all runs on fossil fuels. So I hope it is becoming clear that these technologies that we think are independent, divorced from, no longer reliant on fossil fuels, actually are very closely tied. Another quality of fossil fuels that distinguishes them from the renewable technologies is that they themselves are a stock and not a flow, and you can make things out of nouns, whereas you can't make things out of verbs or out of electricity. So some of the critical things that we have produced from fossil fuels include asphalt, tires, contact lenses, pharmaceuticals, condoms, medical equipment like IV bags and syringes, synthetic fertilizers. I mentioned that in video 1, which is doubling our food output to meet the demands of our growing population. Power cables, like the coating around all of them. And remember, we're going to need several times more of those to be able to transmit all this electricity that we are now planning to be generating. The epoxy, which is part of the wind turbine arm. So if we are no longer extracting fossil fuels, if we are leaving them behind, or more likely, as I described in the first video, if our access to them is declining, then our ability to create these things is also declining. And yeah, you could make them out of something else, but like, how much hemp do you have to grow to make hemp IV bags? It doesn't seem like a suitable solution or substitute. So far, we've basically just been comparing these products themselves, the stocks versus the industrial technology that converts flows into usable energy. And now we are going to consider the factors like in the outside world that are also going to have impacts on our ability to execute this plan of a massive scaling of that equipment. The first one is industrial activity limits. So I think I've made the point so far that we need a lot of materials for all of this, for the turbines and the solar panels and the power cables and the batteries. And there's a limit to how much we can mine in 1 year. We only have so many heavy machinery, so much heavy machinery, and also so many people who are trained to operate it. The second thing is uncooperative climate. So for one, mining requires a lot of water, whereas a lot of the places where we are planning to mine don't have a lot of water right there. And then also because of these catastrophic events that are happening more often, we've seen factories that have had to shut down as a result of drought, canals that are no longer operational, or they're functioning at like 1/3 of their usual traffic because of drought, that kind of thing, which is throwing a wrench in the gears. And the final one is international relations related. This relies on all countries cooperating to trade because all of the inputs, these all involve so many different material inputs. They're found around the world. No country has everything you need to make this within its borders. And yet, if access to fossil fuels is going to be declining, as I explained in the first video, or if we actually decide to put ourselves on a shrinking budget, less likely, whatever, same picture. Yes, we could all the countries, all the leaders could suddenly be inspired to share, but more likely what we tend to see happen is that the more powerful countries invade the others. So here's another snag in the plan. Something that I think most people don't consider is that all of this equipment has a certain lifespan. So after something like 20 something, 30 something years, solar panels and wind turbines start to see their performance decline, things break, and so you need to replace them and then ideally recycle the original into another generation of the equipment, which itself is not perfect, but we'll assume that it is just to simplify this. So not only do you have to complete this whole transition or like add a whole nother layer of industrial infrastructure to at a global scale around the whole planet, because as we see here, remember that we've barely achieved any of that yet, despite the fact that people play it up that like it's going very well. Still, only a very small portion of our energy needs are being met by this technology, so we have a long way to go. But then also, basically, I have to imagine it's going to take long enough, like 20 years, that by the time you are done manufacturing, well, first extracting the raw materials for, then manufacturing and distributing, transporting those, and installing all of it across the whole planet. It'll be time. Oh, and then also manufacturing and repeating that all again to create the backups. It's going to be time to start installing those backups and removing the original generation and recycling it. So that's why I say it seems like we talk about it as a transition, which, at least to me, makes it sound like it's a one-time thing. Like once we do it, then we've pulled it off, we're done, we can sit back, relax, enjoy, and congratulate ourselves. Whereas in fact, this is now this whole new layer of commitments that we are going to be continuously obligated to stay on top of and be maintaining. And of course, that is if we even have the fossil fuels to do it, because remember, all of these steps require fossil fuels, but our access to them is going to be declining. So are we even going to be able to pull off the first round of this? And then are we going to be able to continue to do it for future rounds? Doesn't seem so. And then that's also why I take issue with the term peak oil demand, because that makes it seem like we are on the verge of this moment when we are going to be too good for fossil fuels because we're going to have all our renewables, and so we don't need those nasty pollutants anymore, when in fact this still keeps us very much reliant on them. Our need for them is going to be ongoing, so more likely they are going to dump us before we can ever dump them. And I'm not an engineer, so maybe in all of those previous slides, I'm overlooking something, like someone is working on a way to improve these technologies so that the fact that we are going to start relying on flows instead of stocks need not be an inconvenience. But what I do know is that all of that equipment requires materials. You can't make something out of nothing. Of that, I am sure. And it's not like we're going to go obtain those materials from places that are already developed and places that we are occupying. No one is going to go dig a mine in someone's literal backyard or in the middle of New York City. We are going to go out in places, the so-called wild to get it. And it's kind of crazy to even consider that, like, is there even a square foot of the planet that we haven't yet decimated? But apparently there is, and we're getting around to it now. And whatever marketers decided to call this stuff clean and green did a great job, because those terms just immediately shut off people's brains and they don't think about what the impact is, or they are very ready to dismiss it and say that, well, it's not going to be substantial. But it is going to be substantial. We are talking about a ton of industrial equipment that we are creating, which is going to require a lot of metals and minerals. I feel like all of this should be evident at this point. I'm not going to go into exact data. If you go to my Substack, there are links to articles that are starting to report on this. And it's not just on land, it's also in the oceans. So an interesting thing that was recently discovered is there are these nodules at the bottom of the sea. We've known this, and they happen to contain metals and minerals, exactly what companies need to make solar panels and whatnot. And so they're very tempting. They're just lying there waiting for us to scoop them up and use to make more of our machines. But then also, it was recently discovered that they produce oxygen simply by like being near each other. They exchange molecules or whatever, and that is how there is oxygen at the deep sea. And we've never known that before because it's too deep for photosynthesis to occur. The sunlight doesn't penetrate all the way down there, and so now we've solved this mystery, and it's kind of a miracle, and we're ready to just kind of dismiss that and go ahead and just plow through and grab them. Right now, there are regulations that are probably preventing companies, but don't worry, I'm sure they'll find a way to bypass them. And then another material demand of this that I don't think people think that much about is for these wind turbines that float all the way out in the ocean. Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know, easy to forget about them because they're just out there minding their own business, doing their thing, floating. But actually, they need to be anchored so that they don't float away. And that requires more materials as well as these thick cables because they're generating the electricity out there. And then you need to bring it all the way inland. And that, again, has huge material requirements. And something that I haven't talked about is then like, oh, well, also, what do they do once they're installed? Because that's a popular talking point of like, how do they disrupt the animals that live in those areas where we have installed them? I feel like I don't even have to touch that. There are other people writing about it. And also, it's like, I think it is enough to prove my point that this is environmentally impactful and destructive to just focus on step number one, where we grab all the resources that we need to make them. And another thing that people will offer as like an objection is like, oh, well, we're going to have recycling. And it's like, yeah, but for you to be able to recycle anything, it needs to exist in the first place. So before you can recycle generation one into number two, you have to have created that generation one. And that is where this huge footprint comes from. And there is no way around that because, again, you can't make something out of nothing. I forgot to mention about the nodules also that in the process of harvesting them, we kick up sand, which then makes it extremely difficult for sea life to be able to see and therefore to hunt and then to breathe. And that brings me to this point that like people will say that, well, it's better still to be manufacturing at least some of this clean equipment as opposed to relying entirely on the fossil fuel system because maybe we reduce our emissions into the atmosphere somewhat. And that's true. It would also be true that like I could channel my frustration with mainstream environmental messaging into smoking a cigarette instead of gouging my eyes out with a butter knife. But could you actually say that that would be good for my body? No, both of them are bad. So that brings me to whom does this serve? When we manufacture all of this clean technology that we like to frame as an environment, a pro-environment effort that we are doing to honor non-human life on the planet, what is it supporting? It's supporting civilization because only civilization, human civilization, runs on electricity. So it is ultimately aspiring to harvest and preserve and transport the food for us to eat, to provide surgery and medicine to us, to manufacture and power our products, and to make sure that our homes say either cool during a heat wave or that our air is filtered during a wildfire. That does not benefit the other wild animals, of whom there are so little left, that are roaming around outside. And so now to come back to that core message that I introduced at the end of my first video, the spread and maintenance of this very specific, exceptional method of provisioning for our basic survival needs called civilization comes with requirements and impacts that make it, on net, environmentally draining or damaging, and also, therefore, short-lived. And so we are engaging in colonialism. And I don't just mean like a colony the way that like human on human colonialism. I also mean it the way that when we talk about other species like an ant colony, we are creating this like network so that we can then extract those resources and keep our anthill growing and operating. And we are approaching dead ends on both sides. So to extract the resources, you can't get all the resources that we need to do this whole thing that we do that is so much more material intensive than what everyone else, all the other organisms do. You can't get those resources without engaging in colonialism or imperialism, and not just against other humans, but across the whole planet against all other species. But also, you can't be doing the colonialism without ample resources. Like, you need to be able to power those efforts, and as I explained more in the first video, our ability to power them is also declining. So it's like if one thing doesn't ruin our plan, the other thing will. So it is a trade-off, because any given place can either be an intact ecosystem, a formerly intact ecosystem that we have ravaged for resources, or a formerly intact ecosystem where we have used those resources to then convert it into housing development, a city, even a farm, right? So I realized that this is a good analogy for this is a spaceship. We've built a spaceship that is now populated by 8 billion plus of us. And you might look around and say, well, I don't see any spaceship, but part of it is it's not particularly visible, but there is this whole man-made infrastructure that is unique to our group of humans, our one culture, and it is distinct from the way that all other organisms are meeting their survival needs. What we do is that we have these, it's like we have these robot arms that go out into the environment, extract the resources, and they get sent through all these tubes and shuttled to us in our pods where we live and work. That's not how anybody else does it, and this has come with costs, because to just build all that in the first place, we had to damage our host planet a little bit, and then even just to maintain it now and power it, we have to inflict additional harm. And we are starting to see the signs of that. The ecosystem is suffering, but all we can think to do is add another layer of complexity and infrastructure to the spaceship. And so it might feel like the fight for clean tech is a fight for survival, but it's actually against it. Or if you and I can't survive without it, it doesn't look good for us either way. So now getting on to a few other things that people typically think of as solutions. And we're going to compare them to what we already know, which is here that the civilization health and planetary health are at odds. You can't improve one without making the other worse. And then ultimately, if you prioritize the civilization health, you destroy the planet, and then it destroys us back anyway. That we are already in overshoot. So this isn't just a matter of like not doing additional harm. There's actually all of our environmental impact needs to be beyond neutral. It needs to be negative. And resources down means the ability of the empire and all of its activities, or the empire's ability to carry out its activities, goes down. Those are the base fundamental points that we're operating with now. So first of all, this idea of lowering your footprint. Obviously, we know that one individual is just a drop in the bucket, and that alone is not going to change anything. So let's fast forward to the part where you convince your whole town to reduce their footprints. Wow, look at you go. Well, first of all, companies at the aggregate need to grow, or they are incentivized to grow. Countries are incentivized to grow. That's like how geopolitical tension works. And so the annual rate at which we are expanding our resource consumption rate is also going to continue growing as we try to make more and more goods and structures. Somebody is going to seek to maximize that, however big that can possibly be. And the best that you would manage then is that maybe the company that you're pressuring would switch which materials they use, or maybe they would lower their footprint. But another entity, whether it's a country or a company or a university, that's aiming to outcompete them, will just be like, so, well, thank you very much, and go scoop up that excess slack that they had abstained from using. Again, because as long as there's anything left on the table, there will always be an entity that is willing to, in a sense, backstab the others. Like, you are never going to get perfect cooperation. And so then also whatever products or energy burned or whatever isn't sold to you or benefiting you will simply be sold to someone else or benefit someone else, or it'll end up in a landfill. Except for fossil fuels, which always get burned. We will always burn as much as we can possibly extract because it is so versatile as a fuel. It can work for combustion or for generating electricity. So next up we have efficiency and decoupling, which kind of go hand in hand. So the idea, at least, behind efficiency is that you manage to get just as much, but from doing less. So less becomes more. But the thing is, again, this incentive behind company competition and country competition that makes everyone seek to maximize, or at least certain participants seek to maximize, means that if you invent a chainsaw that operates on half as much energy, everyone will go, or at least some people, companies will go, great, we're going to use the same amount of energy and now just chop down twice as much forest. They cannot pass up an opportunity like that. It's designed into the system that they have to seize it for the sake of economic growth and growing market share and all that. There's also something called the Jevons paradox, kind of like what I've just explained, but there's a great video that's a few minutes long. It's on my Substack. That person does a great job of explaining it, so just go over there and watch that too. Anyway, decoupling is similarly this idea of divorcing something from its environmental impact. So again, so that you can be creating more and more, but without the same proportion of damage that it has historically had. But the thing is, because of the environmental position that we are in, because the imbalance is already so bad, not only would this new miracle technology need to have just a small footprint compared to its, generation one predecessor, and not only would it need to have no impact, but it would actually, if we're actually going to pull off what we're trying to pull off, which is having all of this exist in harmony without doing damage to the planet and actually allowing the planet to recover, it would need to do negative damage or impact. So you'd have to be able to make, an electric car or a solar panel that pops into existence with zero damage to the planet. And in fact, as it comes into existence, it also has to make like an entire city go poof and turn back into a meadow. Okay, and like we're good, but we're not that good. And then recycling. So as far as plastic, the EPA has measured that in the US, about 80% ends up in a landfill, 10% gets incinerated, so now we're breathing it in the air, and then the other 10% does get recycled, but when we do that, the microplastics get released into the water, and then they make it into our bodies. Great. Then glass and metal, sure, those definitely get recycled, but assuming we aren't solving all the other problems, including the one where fossil fuel runs all the modern processes and not for much longer, that recycling process is an industrial one. It involves trucks and factories, and somewhere along the way, the fossil fuels come into play, as do asphalt roads, right? So if we're transporting this thing, there's systems that need to be maintained, or even if it's on a train, like the train tracks and the power lines need to work, which requires a cooperative climate, and the climate is being a little bit uncooperative lately. So too many things need to come together for that to actually continue to benefit. And then with the clean technology, as I mentioned previously, like before you can think about manufacturing the whole thing, you need to have actually 2 generations of it entirely in existence. So a global stock of panels and turbines and batteries and power cables and all that, plus the backups, so that if you are perfectly recycling the first set, the second set can be installed and working while those ones are being recycled. And so like that huge damage that goes into just those first 2 sets that you were exchanging is a lot. And then these other alternatives, the 2 forms of nuclear energy, using hydrolysis to make liquid hydrogen fuel. Again, those are all not made of nothing. Like there actually is some industrial infrastructure involved, whether it's a nuclear facility or one of these reactors. Like, listen, I'm not an engineer, but I'm pretty sure that I'm seeing physical structures being built right there. Like that is made out of stuff. You can't tell me it's not. So additional damage and all the material requirements to keep this thing running, plus as we've said, the things that it contributes to keep going are just human domination. That's not what the planet needs. If your goal is to help the planet, that's not doing this. The trade-off still applies. Here I'll just mention things like financial incentives and corporate green programs, urbanization and population density, and then these high-tech food production. That is just more of the civilization model that is increasing the amount that we are civilizationing on the planet. It is at least at a minimum, depending on the spaceship to remain operational, because you can't have financial incentives unless you have like a financial system and a government and all that kind of stuff. And then corporations are unique to civilization. They only emerged in the modern age. And so it's kind of like a moot point where, again, this relationship, they aren't changing how they might be doing a better job of having a positive relationship with the environment, but the spaceship overall, someone, somewhere, some country, some corporation is still continuing to damage the host planet, and they're not stopping it. And so then also that will lead to the point when the planet can't give us anymore and the spaceship starts to fail, and then that will take them down with it. So it doesn't matter how hard they're trying. Urbanization, population density. I mentioned in my first video how actually clustering people into a city means that adds to the resource requirements to keep them fed, because then you have to have the infrastructure to transport the food into them. And also, since they aren't out in fields doing the work, then you need to have the machines to be doing the work. And like, where do the materials and the fuel for those machines come from? And then high-tech food production, also more demanding on materials and energy, because like when it's stacked indoors, the sun isn't shining, so then you actually have to generate artificial light and all that kind of stuff. So that's also not going to do well once supply chains start to struggle. So just a few other objections that I often hear when people are trying to argue for the fact that everything's going to be okay. One of them is, well, humans have overcome other challenges, sure, and specifically human civilizations. Now, when they do that, it's by continuing to trample on other species. So there's a lot of species who, when we triumph, they become the victims. But yeah, I've been saying that, well, civilization is basically designed to fail. And that's true of all the blueprints, whether you're talking about the ancient Rome model or the modern technological industrial civilization model. It's all essentially the same. It is using this materially intensive method of extracting resources from your environment rather than being integrated into it. And the way that previous civilizations have met those challenges, though, is by, well, either they've failed to, and we can think of some examples like that where these civilizations become abandoned, or they either absorb or get absorbed by other civilizations, thereby expanding their territory and then gaining access to more resources. Because without those material resources, you can't keep going. And we have now reached a point that because modern civilization now encompasses the globe, there is literally no other space. We're running out of space that we can exploit. And so our go-to strategy when we've been backed up into a corner is no longer going to work for us. And then the other thing is, well, the market will sort it out. The market helps us extract and allocate resources. It encourages the addition of layers to the spaceship. It encourages that tornado metaphor that I used in the previous video, where we're just adding population density and division of labor, and it just makes that spiral more out of control. It does not encourage restraint. So yeah, because obviously, like, the stock market needs to keep growing and the economy needs to keep growing to be considered healthy. And that correlates to a greater material footprint because it doesn't grow out of nothing. So that's it. I hope this was at least less dark than the first video. Then again, I did just probably crush the final things that people were holding on to for hope. Don't worry, in the third video, it's coming up next, I will go over specific examples of how our civilization spaceship has this vampiric relationship with its host planet and is just turning the whole thing into this toxic, chaotic, lifeless hellscape. Like, sorry, but I promise that if you make it through to the 7th video, I will explain that facing all of this actually comes with advantages. But first, you have to put in the time and effort to process the full situation before you can access those benefits. So stick with it.